Okay, welcome to Teachers on Teaching. During finals week, which is a new experiment for us, and I'm so gratified to see that people had time in their schedules to come listen to Sabrina Weiss talk about guiding safe discussions of high-stakes topics. Just a little bit about Sabrina, visiting assistant professor in the Department of Science, Technology, and Society. Sabrina's research interests include embodied cognition, cyborg and technology theory, and intersectional ethical theory across biological and technological practices. Now, teaching being a technological practice, this is an interesting lens into ethical practices in teaching. Courses Sabrina teaches include science, technology, and values, biomedical issues in science and technology, gender science and technology, and introduction to environmental studies. Please join me in welcoming Sabrina Weiss.
Thank you very much, Jeremiah. And thank you very much for coming in during finals week. I tried to include a few amusing videos like what we had at the beginning, because I know there's a lot of stress on everybody's plate right now. First thing I wanted to ask, though, was because my goal here is to help give some suggestions and advice on ways that you can approach talking about these sorts of topics in the classroom. I was wondering if each of you could just really quickly introduce yourself, say, what department or what school you're in, what kinds of controversial topics you're interested in working with students on. That would be really helpful for me to get an idea of where I could best help you. So if you could start.
Only if you want your remarks captured for captioning and the recording. We can forego the microphone in the beginning, but when we move to the Q&A, I'll make sure.
Okay, that sounds fair. Yeah, it's more for my interest.
I'm Katie Bush. I work at the School of Individualized Study. I don't know that I have any high-stakes topics that we're talking about right now, but we're an interdisciplinary program, and so our graduate level, we have an introduction to our degree, which can cover any number of topics, so it's very possible there could be high-stakes conversations going on.
Excellent. And yeah, interdisciplinary approaches are really very effective at dealing with the complicated topics we have today. So wonderful. Thank you.
I'm Tanya Schuler. I'm in the English Language Center. My students are all international students learning English or perfecting their English so they can enter their academic programs. High-stakes topics are not really extremely relevant to what we do, but we do run into some cultural conversations or even cultural expectations that students have to deal with, and they have to confront the fact that maybe their value system does not admit of this practice in the classroom. And so I was interested to hear how you deal with such discussions.
I'm Chris Wilk. I also work in the English Language Center and same.
My name is Inga Meffert. I am from the Academic Support Center, actually a neighbor of Chris and Tanya. And we are responsible to oversee the Year 1 first-year transition course for all incoming freshmen. Year 1 is ideally heavily discussion-based, and so in order to facilitate students' transitions into the college environment, topics such as academic integrity, dishonesty, alcohol, substance abuse issues can come up, mental health-related issues, sexual assault, Title IX cases, things of that nature. So I'm just curious to see, given our population, what other best practices you could suggest.
Jason Scott. I teach in the Criminal Justice Department in the College of Liberal Arts. I teach classes in the Introduction to Criminal Justice seminar in Criminal Justice and Public Policy, class on crime, justice, and communities, as well as law enforcement. The high-stakes topics in criminal justice are almost endless, but the ones that usually come up that generate more discussion include things like gun control, any topic related to race, ethnicity, disparity within the criminal justice system, police use of force and response to that, capital punishment, drug legalization. These are all sort of the high stakes topics that students tend to be
My name is Jeffrey Burnett. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. I teach a couple different classes that really focus on race and gender. In particular, I teach the economics of Native America and try to explain to students some of the different issues involving Native American communities. And at the beginning, we start off with a discussion of history and at times have a very different lens that we look through the same exact events that they've been educated about since they were young. So that class in particular, as well as the Native Americans in film class. But I also teach the economics of women in the family and talk about issues related to workplace discrimination, especially opportunity, involving with other coworkers and how those things can impact your earnings and economic outcomes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to run through this presentation quickly. If you have a burning question at the end of one of the sections, then feel free. Otherwise, we can kind of go through this. I can share some things that I've observed. And then from there, I'd like to have kind of an open discussion forum on coming up with ideas or thinking about ways that we could augment or work on things that you're teaching. So outline, I trust you all can read the slides. I had some students do presentations, and some of them learned the hard way what not to do in presentations and such. So critical thinking has become a big buzzword. My first year here, there was this big presentation. Somebody came in and said how our measurement of critical thinking in students is correlated to the amount of reading and writing that they do. So give them more reading and writing, ergo post hoc, ergo propter hoc, they will have better critical thinking. And I raised my hand and commented how I have observed that students don't even have basic writing skills. So how are we supposed to assess this? Several of the more senior professors seemed very pleased by that and agreed. But regardless, critical thinking is important, but it's very hard for people to actually define what critical thinking is. And even my students seem to think that critical thinking means criticizing thinking. Right? How many of you have run into that where you present some concept and then they try to push back against it and try to discount it, maybe if they haven't even read it? And I think that's one of the big things to emphasize to the students, to lay out at the very beginning. If you want to emphasize critical thinking, tell them, here's how you do critical thinking. It is not criticizing. You are welcome to respond and ask questions, but you have to be able to talk about this idea first. We have a lot of difficulty standardizing the teaching of it. How many of you have noticed some socio-cultural resistance from students, whether it's for poverty, race issues, other topics maybe related to American culture and society? And so these are some larger barriers that we're all dealing with. Let's see here. At the same time, I've been noticing students are not quite as prepared academically. I went to college a while ago. I went to grad school. I coached high school level debate. And when I came here, it was a little bit of a shock because I was expecting them to be around high school debater levels, and that was not quite the case. And as a lot of us know, the history of the university, the purpose of it has changed. The purpose of a university education has changed. Specific to here, I see a lot of students coming in wanting to get a job, that they're getting skills and things that will help them. It's not so much, oh, we want to think great thoughts and all of that, which is fine, but you can still sneak some in if you're careful. Their attention's diverted when we switch to the semester system. I've heard from students they're taking 6 to 8 classes a semester, and especially as somebody who teaches the ethics perspectives, gen ed, I know my classes tend to get deprioritized. And so anything I can do to provoke them, get them interested, and lay out clear standards for here's what I want you to be able to walk away from this class with seems to help a lot. And then we have things like the students as customers model and the helicopter parents. So one of the challenges, I think, is avoiding getting into this arms race, kind of like Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd pulling out the bigger and bigger guns. If you come in all ready to talk about this topic because it's so apparent to us, because we've done the reading, we have the education, of course, you know, there is a bias against black people in, you know, when police get involved, or there is a bias in terms of economic situations. And there are students where it is not the case. And oh my God, why are they bringing up black people again? Why do they have to bring up race? And so then you're trying to respond to that. They say, nuh-uh, you say, yes, it is, and then things start to escalate. How many of you have seen a situation, maybe your class, other classes, where things have kind of escalated a bit? And that's a really, really difficult place to be. And so the trick is you want to avoid that situation from the beginning. I've also seen some giving up. Fewer papers being assigned, which makes it harder on the people who do assign papers. And the students come out of college not able to write. And that's a very difficult place for them to be in. I also, because I'm a gamer, I play video games. And so one of the things that I recognize are second order strategies that come up in response to rules. So for example, if you grade based on attendance, then students are going to calculate how many points they would lose if they did not come to class. And they will cut it as finely as they can, and then they will try to negotiate with you. And then, how many of you have had a very detailed medical information sent to you about why they were sick and couldn't make it? I joke that I don't want students sending me pictures of their snot on email to prove that they were sick. So I just don't even grade on attendance. But I tell them important stuff gets put out that will make your assignments much easier. And just like in the workplace, the real life training that you guys want, if you don't show up to work regularly, regardless of if you have an excuse or not, it's going to suffer. You're going to have more difficulties. And sometimes students who don't show up, you can tell if they haven't been coming. And so instead of falling into that negotiating game over points, you just say, oh, I put out this information 3 times in class. The people who showed up, they were fine. Where were you? And if you're just not bothered by it and you just let them know this is the consequence of it, then they're forced to recognize, oh yes, I have to grow up and be an adult. I can't game this system anymore. So you change it, but you don't do it arbitrarily. You do it in a way that will reflect the real world situations that they're going to be in. How many have had a student accuse some information you gave out as being biased? Anyone? No? No? Okay. I expect the bias argument at some point. I teach Michael Pollan, Omnivore's Dilemma, in my class to open up discussion about food issues. And in the second section of it, he talks about pasture farming, free-range farming, and all of that. And I expect somebody by that point to stand up and say, Pollan seems very biased in favor of farmers. And because now I expect and anticipate somebody to bring up bias, I have a whole lecture discussion prepared for them. And I say, okay, we're not talking about this topic today. We're going to talk about bias. And I ask them, why is bias bad? And then I ask them, is there any source that is unbiased? How do you prevent bias? And what they find out is that bias is thrown around a huge amount. It's thrown out in our media. It's thrown out in discussions. Anytime somebody is a proponent of something, they are accused of cherry picking. They're accused of being biased. If you are advocating for a position, then having that bias is not a bad thing. If you're claiming to be, to be authoritative, to have complete, balanced information about things, and then you have a bias built in, then that can be damaging. And so then I tell them, well, I could give you completely unbiased information. It'll be about 1,000 more pages of reading. Does anyone want that? So Pollan does not claim to be an authority on food or on farming as a whole industry or anything like that. He's saying, hey, this is neat. This is a neat alternative to factory farming. And even the last time we talked about this, textbooks came up. Somebody claimed that textbooks are unbiased. Now, bless their hearts, another student actually pointed out how textbooks are not biased. So they actually know a fair amount. And if you can get them talking with each other and calling each other out to bring in their own experiences and their own knowledge, then you can get them to actually engage in a discussion now about bias. And in STS, talking about how does science happen? How do we come to know things? How do we decide what is valid information and what is not is entirely within our realm. And that's probably one of the most important discussions to have. But instead of just bringing it up to them, just wait for them to have it. So there will be some common themes that you will see with students that they bring up. I bring up bias specifically because I've noticed discursively it's a defense mechanism. When we were being educated, we had encyclopedias, we had the nightly news, we had authoritative sources of knowledge that nobody really needed to question much. Nowadays, everything is questioned. They have their Facebook feed, they have YouTube, they have Reddit, they have Twitter, they have all of these things, and every possible source they have is under question now. It's under scrutiny. And so they can't trust anything. So they have so much information and they have no way to filter it. Claiming that something is biased rhetorically is one of the easiest ways to filter out information. Because what this is saying is that this is not good information and this has no place here. If you accuse somebody of being biased, you're saying you have an ulterior motive, you should not be in this discussion. Boom. You have just closed down discussion, you have shut out a person. Now you've cut down your workload by a huge amount. And so they're doing it because they have no other way to talk about this information. And so if you substitute better ways for them to talk about it, if you give them better ways to filter out information and to judge and evaluate it, and then emphasize the value of discussion, that, okay, somebody may have a bit of a bias, but can we still have a good discussion about this? If you can, then it's worth having the discussion. Because if you're just shutting down discussion, you're being kind of lazy, and then we have nothing to talk about. Because if everything's biased, we're just going to sit here. So if you do that, rather than saying, no, it's not biased, have them try to explain why it's biased. And you'll find a lot of them have trouble going further. And it's just kind of a knee-jerk reaction they've learned from other people. So for discussions, especially in my biomedical issues class, where we talk about cancer, we talk about death and dying, we talk about disability, all of that, it takes time to build up trust. About the first third of the semester, it's a lot of me talking, it's a lot of me throwing out questions openly. What was something interesting about the reading you saw? Does anybody have, an interesting perspective on this? Just open-ended questions, engaging them. By the end of the semester, I give them a little bit of material to do for a reflection. I'll show you how I do that later. And I step out of the room for a minute, and then I come back in and listen to how they are, and the energy level is so high. And they're chattering, they're talking, they're debating, they're doing all of this. But it takes time to build up that trust. And if you can build that trust from the beginning, to really show that you are interested in discussing, you're interested in hearing, and when they have a concern, you're interested in giving them tools to better frame those concerns. Then they're more likely to engage and to not pull back from sharing what their thoughts are. I do kind of an open but controlled, moderated discussion. Some people will do like Beanie Baby moderation. My boss does. You give a Beanie Baby to someone, they get to choose who to throw the Beanie Baby to, who gets to speak next, a talking stick method. I still hold control, but and this allows me to engage students who haven't spoken as much. It also lets us finish out a thread and then come back to a new thread that somebody else opens up. And it's really important to recognize if somebody says something off topic, but it's a good discussion. Say, I'm going to put a pin in it and we'll come back to this later because this is really good. Finish it up and then come back to it. And this way they get that positive validation and they're more likely to contribute later. I also ask students to do a generous interpretation. If somebody says something that is hurtful or comes across as offensive, to try to think about it as this person is not intending to hurt people by saying this, but they have a certain perspective. In STS, we call it limited objectivity, that from your experiences, you've only seen certain things, and this is how you perceive the world. And so you will not be able to talk about things from other perspectives. But other people have different perspectives. And so by sharing these, and by recognizing that people are speaking from their own experiences, you can now expand on their experiences and say, well, you see it in this way, I see it in this way. Why do we see it differently? Don't just let people stop and say, you have your opinion, I have mine, we're just going to sit here and continue to believe that way. My first semester, I would ask students for evidence. When a student says something, gay marriage is unnatural, I'll say, okay, can you give me some evidence for that? And they get very threatened by this because they're not used to having to respond. And I am very pro-technology, I'm very pro-social media, but I've noticed that platforms like Twitter don't encourage back and forth discussion as much as other platforms have done in the past. And so somebody will say something, and no one ever is able to get back to them and say, well, can you explain this further? And as a result, they get very uncomfortable when even a friendly question, can you tell me more? Can you explain more? They don't know how to respond to that. And finding ways to encourage them to work on this is a good way. You can even have them do reflection opportunities before and after class. And that can be a way for them to get their thoughts in order, because they usually don't take 3 minutes to sit down with nothing distracting them, to think about what did I read in this chapter, what bothered me about the chapter, what was interesting, what was provocative. They oftentimes don't even have that time. And so if you can sacrifice a few minutes of your class time at the beginning, that will allow them to focus, and that gives them a chance to improve the discussion that happens. Introverted students. I'm an introvert. First day of class, I tell them I'm an introvert. I know I don't look like one, but I am. And instantly I see a bunch of students' eyes just light up. And they're so happy, they're so relieved. And I do a few things in my class to be introvert friendly. Introverts, there's different theories about it. Introverts generally get energy by being alone. They get drained of energy when they're around people for a long time. Sometimes they need a little bit longer to think. They tend to have very profound thoughts, but they need a little bit of time. And then once the opportunity to speak passes, then they get the idea. So I have online forum posts, and I encourage them to post there after class. So this way, the people who get inspiration a little bit later have a chance to contribute to a discussion. I include that focused reflection at the start of class. So this way, even if an introvert doesn't say anything, they've had a chance to think about something, and now they're listening and taking in information, and that's going to be interacting with the thoughts they came in with. I also do small group discussions for warm-ups, and I found this is a really good way to get their energy up. So I'll post a few questions on the board. It'll be something like, for this chapter, what was something new that you learned? What was something counterintuitive? Sometimes what was something that made you uncomfortable? And what was an example of science and technology from this chapter? Some very open-ended questions. And I have them get into groups. I say no dates, so can't just be 2 people, but at least 3 or more. And they get into little clusters and they start talking. And this way, even if somebody doesn't really actively participate in the big group discussion, I have faith that they got something very meaningful out of this small group discussion for about 5 minutes or so. And it's a way for them to kind of test out ideas. So this way, the people who maybe wouldn't have been comfortable speaking in class without testing it, they have a little more confidence now that, okay, this idea seems pretty good, or other people agreed, and they'll contribute it to the class. So that's another way to set up discussions that allows the students to still do learning in a different sort of style where you're not directing it. Big thing that I learned was that students want to talk about controversial topics. Last semester, the Robin Thicke concert that happened, I had someone who was active in student government in my course. And so he was telling me about the process and the controversy, the debate. Did they want Robin Thicke on campus? Some people didn't. Some people thought his lyrics were offensive. Some people thought, even if it's offensive, we should have it for free speech. All of this stuff. They asked me, what are my thoughts on gay marriage or abortion or fracking or whatever? They want to talk about it, but they don't have the tools for it. And interestingly, they don't always see their own biases. So when you bring up something about poverty or something that they have a very set view on because of their upbringing, they don't see their own biases in this. They don't see how that is a controversial topic. So there's kind of a twofold challenge here in giving them tools to talk about controversial topics, and hopefully at the same time, bridging that gap for them to use those tools to then understand their own biases. Lastly, I like to leverage student ecology. So you always have a few pillars of the classroom, a few students who are maybe they're extroverted, maybe they're just authoritative. They tend to be very active participants in the discussions. Identify them and encourage them. But if they start overrunning the discussion, chat with them after class and say, hey, I love your contributions. I want to make sure that other students get a chance to contribute. After a little while, sometimes they'll say, okay, somebody who hasn't said anything yet. While smiling at the active students. This way they know that I'm not rejecting them. And they also appreciate that other people should get a chance to bring something in too. Encouraging leadership among them. And as I mentioned before with the attendance, emphasizing realistic consequences over punitive actions. And just saying, well, I talked about this in class a few times. You're supposed to come here. Sorry you didn't make it. You could have asked somebody. I also tell the students, I say, it's your choice. If you want to help your buddy out who hasn't been coming to class with this information, that's your option. So that's encouraging them to work with each other and to, to work as, they would in a professional situation. Okay, before I go into some project examples, I'd like to get some thoughts from you. Have any of these sorts of situations come up? Do you have questions or scenarios that you've had to deal with, perhaps, that you might like to talk about?
So that we have this closed captioned.
I don't have a specific scenario, but I do have a question about process. If students have difficulty reflecting on their own biases, do you ever use the technique of having them take up the opposite point of view?
Yes, at times. A class I taught last semester was the capstone seminar for STS, and we did debates in there. There were 5 debates. We negotiated the topics. We had one on an environmental topic, one on a medical topic, and then I forgot what areas the others were. And I told the students they had to come up with a position, both pro and con, for the resolution. And so that's one thing that I have in a structured situation. I personally would not, if there were a particular student who were having this problem, I probably would not do that for them unless they were actively coming to me for help. If they were coming to me for help, then absolutely. I think that could be a very good way to go about things. Sometimes, and this is the student ecology, sometimes I'll let a student just say something and become very unpopular. One of my earlier semesters in science, technology, values, I start out by talking about cyberbullying, and then I transition from that to catcalling and sexual harassment. And we were talking about cyberbullying, and I asked the students, and I try to ask depersonalized questions. So instead of asking, have you been cyberbullied, I'll ask, do you know somebody who's been cyberbullied? And a lot of them will volunteer and say that they were. But this way it gives them a little bit of extra space if they need. And many students have been cyberbullied. Many students know people who have been. They all thought yes, this is a serious problem. And there's one kid who they don't really like anyway because he's been a bit of a know-it-all in the class. He says, I don't see what the problem with cyberbullying is. I think it's overblown. All of a sudden, laser eyes all on this student. And I didn't have to say anything. I am not advocating that the other students be hostile towards him, but there are students who need to understand the consequences of what they say. And immediately hands started shooting up, and students were asking, well, why do you think this? Why do you think that? And he's never been challenged before. He's been able to get away with saying things and having nobody push back. That was a very important learning experience for him. So you still want to try to step in before it gets too intense, but sometimes let the students, give them enough rope to hang themselves with. And it is valuable for them to recognize, whoa, this thing that was fact for me and my family is not going to fly out here. I think that if you have an international student who is very clearly in the minority in a class, that might be a good opportunity for intervention afterwards to make sure, because you don't want them to end up too alienated. So it's a little bit of a judgment call, but I think that that peer response can be a very valuable tool, and it can be a wake-up call for them to realize, oh, something is weird here. I need to investigate this further. And then you can have that discussion and say, why do you think those students had problems with what you said? Thank you. Anyone else?
Hi, I like your idea about pinning comments for later discussions. I don't recall seeing many instances in which that happens, either because the instructor naturally doesn't have time to write down that comment, or the other situation is the students, for whatever reason, are reluctant or forget to bring up the point later on. So what strategies do you have for
the whiteboard?
returning?
Yes. The whiteboard is my friend because I have a lot of, I usually have at least one, maybe up to 3 or 4 deaf or hard of hearing students. I have interpreters and I have captionists. And so I've gotten in the habit of writing keywords and phrases on the board. I've just had to get in practice of doing that. And so if somebody brings up something, I'll write a 1-word or 2-word phrase or comment on there. Because when we're talking about, let's say, designer babies, I already anticipate what they're probably going to want to bring up. So I kind of already know what things they're going to want to talk about. But when somebody brings it up, I'll write it on the board. And so we have this whole list of kind of brainstorming of ideas and responses that come from the students. And this is a way for me to keep track of what's going on. Sometimes I'll then circle something or underline it as a reminder to myself. Or you can even assign a student. You can say, that's really good, remind me later. And that encourages them to do that. But this is best done in a more collaborative guided discussion format, which is how most of my classes are. Is I come into class with a few main topics I want to cover from the reading. I give them that reflection time. I give them the group discussion time. This is with upper division students too. They tend to work a little better with this. And then I want to make sure we hit 3 main points of this reading, and I go fishing. And usually they will cover it. And then once we've kind of exhausted the things they've talked about, I just make sure, okay, here's one more thing that I think is a really important takeaway, da-da-da-da-da. And by that point, you can talk for 5 minutes straight, and they've already been talking, so they don't feel like they're being lectured at. You know, you still are the professor, you still are the instructor, and you are sharing this really cool information with them. And even though I still talk for a majority of classes, the students feel like it's very discussion-oriented and collaborative. And apparently it's more so than a lot of their classes are. So a little bit goes a long way in letting them feel trusted and like they're contributing. Does that help?
Helps very much.
Oh, good. Also, you can also take notes. I was taking notes on what you were saying. That might be a little bit of debater skill that I picked up. But come up with something that works for you, that you're able to do as you're talking. Just jot down a quick note to yourself to keep track of. And I think if you can come back to those pinned topics, that shows the students that you're paying attention, and that cultivates that trust as well. So if you can build up that skill to do it, it's really valuable.
I was just wondering, at the beginning of the semester, you mentioned you'll ask different questions of the students, and they're open-ended. And I've done some of that myself, but at times I find that the students just kind of stare at me. I'll try to rephrase it a slightly different way, and I'll sit there and wait for a while because I'm fully aware that when everybody's looking at you, it can kind of, and there's quiet in the classroom, it can be a little bit uncomfortable when I figure I'm used to people staring at me now in the classroom, and it now starts to become uncomfortable on the part of the students to have that much silence. But I was wondering if there are other techniques that you've employed, especially at the beginning, to try to get students to come out and contribute to the discussion.
Well, first of all, that discomfort is good. Let them wallow in that a while. Most people get really uncomfortable if there's silence. And I get a lot of the blank stares. I get the blank stares all the time. And just let them, and don't let them see, just don't care. Just, especially if you feel like you put out a very reasonable basic question, I allow laptops in the classroom. I will mock and tease someone who is clearly looking at Facebook, sometimes even if I walk behind them and I can see it. But I tell them, please do not detract from the learning environment of other students. And I actually encourage them, please look stuff up. If I'm giving you a statistic that sounds sketchy, please look it up. Check me on it. You know, when we talk about the reading, I'll ask, what was an important point that Paulin brought up? Now, because I give that reflection time at the beginning, they have less excuse for it. And what I see further along in the semester is I'll see this, when I ask a question that's more reading specific, I'll see the students pull out the book and they'll be looking at it, or they'll be looking through the PDF. So, and I'll tell them, and I'll even say, if you didn't do the reading, take those 3 minutes and flip through it. Pick out something. because 3 minutes of looking at the reading is better than no time looking at the reading. And so let them make up for their lack of planning ahead of time. So that's one thing. What types of questions would you ask?
Oh, very similar. What are some of the things that you found most interesting in this particular paper? And at times I've had them write for like a little bit of a reflection. So like you mentioned, I know that they've had some time to think about it, and they have something there in front of them. I know because they handed in, and I've read what they've written, and have come back to them and said, contribute to the class. These are great points. It'd be awesome if you shared them more with the class.
Okay, good. Sounds like you're doing it very well. Give them a few minutes at the beginning of class and emphasize this is silent individual reflection. So they're alone with themselves in the reading, and have those questions up on the board. I write them out on the board so they're clear to see. And at that point, ask them and just let them sit there in silence. Somebody will come up with something. The other thing that I'll do is Daily Show, Colbert Report, Nightly Show, those shows, they are my best friends. When we talked about food and poverty and access, there's a great segment of the Daily Show on food stamps and how people restrict what people can buy. There were people complaining about people buying seafood. How dare they buy luxury seafood, yada, yada. And so it really got into our images of poverty and what do poor people look like and smell like and what is poor people's food. And so especially towards the beginning, I will show a lot of short videos, 3 to 5 minutes at the beginning of class to provoke them. And so I'll show that video and get them all talking about Jon Stewart and ha ha ha, look at these silly people. And then I'll say, okay, so now let's look at the reading. What are some things that came up in the reading? So that's another thing that you can do, give them a bit of an energy boost. I think you'll need more of those at the beginning of the semester to get them provoked. Sometimes save a day, especially if you have a 3-day-a-week course, especially Monday. Give them a video or something to start out with as a provocation. I have this whole library of videos that I use. And especially humorous ones, those help detach them from internalizing the problem. If there's a video on catcalling, I have one on a guy being stared at with yoga pants on. And instead of saying, oh, men are evil for looking at women, I show this video of these guys freaking out over yoga pants. Let me pull this up real quick. And here.
What? You liked what you saw, bro?
So this guy's wearing yoga pants, and guys are mistaking him for a girl, and they're checking him out.
What?
Oh, man, what if you got old leggings?
Why you staring at my butt, dude? Huh? What? You're staring at my butt? Hey, relax, dog. You're staring at it. Hey, you want to? Hey, what? You want to sock it? You want me to twerk? Hey, watch this. Watch this. You'll like this part. Right? Watch this. Ready? Oh, man. What's up, dog?
So I'll show a video like this, and then I'll ask him, why are those guys freaking out? And after everyone's done laughing, they're able to say, oh, they were expecting him to be a girl. Okay, why were they looking at him? Why were they expecting this? And that's a way to lead into kind of a more difficult conversation where people are afraid of stepping into a landmine zone sometimes. So that's another thing that you could do to give them a little bit more permission. Then instead of saying, well, I do this, say, well, those guys in the video were doing this because, and that helps them to feel a little more detached, a little bit safer too. But at the beginning, you're cultivating it. It's like starting a campfire. You got to keep working with it a little. Sometimes you have to just step back and let them, eventually come up with something, because they're still trying to feel you out. Most people are not used to speaking up in these sorts of situations, and you have to, let them know it's okay, and that it takes time. So I'm really glad that you are trying to do it.
Have you found that in a discussion-oriented class that you have to be flexible with your schedule? And it seems to me like it's unpredictable, and some discussions kind of take on a life of their own, and that what you had planned to cover on one day may not happen. So how do you deal with that?
First of all, I don't give tests. I give about 3 reflection papers that are open-ended. They have to cover key topics, in my case, science, technology, values in my STV class. And I have other projects. I start them off with a very low effort food project. They go to some place where food is served, and they have to pick one healthy and one unhealthy food and compare them in terms of access, appearance, cost, who is eating it. I give them a couple short readings on how to do ethnographic observation, and most of them go to Gracie's, and it gives them a chance to bond over telling me how terrible Gracie's is. And I actually went to Gracie's, and they were very impressed with that. If you really want to get on Students' Good Site, go to Gracie's and hold office hours there. But this was a way to let them talk about, oh, when I was at home, we got to eat organic food, we got to eat really good food, all of this, and I'm at Gracie's, I don't have a car, I don't have time, I can't go out and get good food. That's a perfect opportunity to talk about people in poverty, to talk about food deserts. And then I have another project, the bus project, where I have them ride the public bus, the 24, which I will ride in the winter, to downtown. I just say you have to ride this bus to downtown, and then report back on it. That's all I tell them. And they have to figure it out. Again, very, very good learning opportunity. So for these types of projects, I definitely budget a full day to discuss. But I would rather, if a couple years ago when there was the big crisis over in Syria, and it was hitting the news and such, the next day in class, I said, guys, we're not doing this lesson plan, we're going to talk about Syria. We're going to do a class exercise. And so it depends on how you set up the course. I build in a week or 2 of squish room at the end, so this way I can adjust my schedule as needed. We have semesters, take advantage of the extra time there. And remember too that if the students are burning to talk about something, or if a discussion is going really well and you want to roll with it, they are learning. They are learning a huge amount. They are benefiting from that. So you are not taking anything away. I don't know exactly what your particular learning objectives are in the class, but if they are discussing and they are excited about it, that is huge. That could be that experience from college that they remember years from now. And so there is incredible value in that. So don't be afraid to drop the lesson plan. Turn something into an online assignment post. If there was a reading you wanted them to do, have them do a reading reflection online. And just tell them, I'm going to go through this, I'm going to give you participation points on it, you just have to do it. You can do that. Use the online resources as well to extend or augment the class discussions. It is more valuable for them to have that live FaceTime discussion on a topic where everyone's energy is good and in sync. I give you permission. This is a really cool exercise, especially if you're doing justice, poverty, those sorts of things. Students get very comfortable in the particular place in the classroom they're sitting in, and I ask them to flip. So depending on how it is, if this were a full classroom here, I would have the 2 sides, swap sides, and then let's say there were some seats up front here, I would have the front and the back switch. Sometimes you'll have the control group right here in the middle, and I'll just keep them there. And then, once everyone is flipped, they've all groaned and moaned, and you can see the students are very uncomfortable. Use this very judiciously, they get very uncomfortable. And then ask them, what do you notice? I've had students realize there's a clock in the classroom. I've had students very upset because we were in the glass room, 450 or whatever, because there's a black wall and there's a clear wall, and they're saying, I can't concentrate now because there's all this stuff going on outside there. Students front and back, you'll find out why they're sitting front or back. The students in the front want to be motivated, part of the discussion. They may have hearing problems, they may have vision problems. Students in the back want to be able to see everybody, and they get very uncomfortable having everyone at their back. And have them share this. And it's this mutual discomfort, but it's also this discovery. The student who never knew there was a clock there, everyone else goes, ha, ha, ha. Well, of course there was a clock there. In STS, we call this standpoint theory, that the same activity or situation, like voting, can look completely different depending on where in society you are. That going to Wegmans to shop for fresh produce looks completely different on if you are rich and have a car and have lots of time to go shop, or if you are poor, have to ride the bus and are working 3 jobs with kids. And this is a way to open up to them how to recognize this, how to get a little bit of sympathy and sometimes empathy for different positions in society. So there's very simple activities you can do that leverage the student's own situation to recognize, oh wow, this little thing made me uncomfortable. Imagine how uncomfortable this other thing could make other people. So that can be a really good way to just have a nice discussion about that. Who's heard of the trolley problem? So it's a classic ethical philosophy dilemma. There's a train that's going along, the track splits because of infrastructure cuts. You can make whatever social commentary you want. The tracks have washed away. It goes down to a big pit with lots of sharp rocks. If the train goes down into that pit, everybody dies. We'll say there's 100 people on the train. If it goes onto the other track, they'll be safe. There's a switch here that you can flip to divert the train. So we asked, do you have a moral obligation? Do you have a legal obligation to flip that switch? They're pretty cool on that. Then you start putting different people on that other track. First you put a homeless person, then you put a school bus of kids, then you put a bus full of convicts on there, you put their mom, you put their favorite pet. So you go through these sorts of exercises. This you can do in a full group and they get so engaged. I think that especially if you're doing social justice, criminal justice, these are really good because our justice systems are based on consequentialist ethics and deontological ethics. I also give them a hefty dose of a social contract theory. I'm pretty sure, yeah, you do that too. And then the Titanic, it's the lifeboat situation. Who gets to go on the lifeboat, who doesn't? Spoiler alert, they always choose the pregnant woman because she's a 2-for-1 deal, even though they don't think about what it's like to have a 3-month pregnant woman on a lifeboat. So it's a good way to get them to think about that. If you want to bring up gender, give them a nurse and a military veteran and listen in their groups to see how many gender them automatically and see how many of them ask about the gender. Ask them, why do we have women and children first? That allows you to talk about family and society and institutional sexism and all of those wonderful things. Then you can ask, well, why are the guys so expendable? And that's something that I'm very careful to do is when talking about gender, I take Michael Kimmel's approach, where I oftentimes will start by talking about masculinity because most of my students are guys. A lot of them are gamers, a lot of them are introverts, and I talk about conventional masculine standards and stereotypes and use that as a way to open up discussion of institutional sexism, patriarchal standards, and all of that. And they tend to be pretty copacetic with that. So there are some weaknesses to these exercises, but if you use them as a starting point for discussion, as a way to give them some basis for how are things, especially in America, decided. We have the consequentialist system that looks at consequences and body counts. We have the deontological kind of more values-based, duty-based system, then it's a really great way to get them engaged. Then you can give them some supplementary readings and say, here's where these come from. But very active exercises, they get very passionate about it too. The last thing I wanted to talk about is I give them a research project on the Hurricane Katrina disaster. And I allow them to pick groups, about 4 to 5 people each, so I end up with about 8 groups. And I have each group take one of several topics on it. So we have science, technology, economy, policy, politics. I've added policing. Is it a natural or social disaster? International perspectives, and let's see, what's health issues. So I give them a choice of about 9 or 10 topics. I end up with 8 of them. So what happens is they're all looking at the Hurricane Katrina disaster from different perspectives. They have to find 15 articles, 10 of which have to be peer-reviewed, write an executive summary paper. I'm loose on the length, 4 to 5 pages, double-spaced, doesn't have to be long. And they have to give an 8-minute presentation. I emphasize to them over and over, not everyone has to be up there for the presentation. One group always does do this. And they also have to give an activity log that says when did they meet, who was active in things. This way, if there's disputes, because there always are, that lets you kind of see what's going on. And what's really neat about this project is especially the controversial topics. I learned from students on the policing topic about the militias of basically upper-class white people who are going around with guns. and this thing called the paper bag test, which has historical meaning with African Americans, where people whose skin was lighter than the color of a paper bag were treated better. In the case of the militias after Hurricane Katrina, it was if their skin is darker than this paper bag, we're going to shoot them. I learned about this from the students. And this is another very important thing. The more controversial the topic is, the better you are at maneuvering students into getting that information and presenting it, the more likely the other students are to trust it or to have a discussion on it. Because then you're not biased. These students have found it, and now they're going to discuss it. And that I found has been very effective. Let the students find the looting versus finding media controversy that came up and let them present it. Because they will trust that, they will engage with that better. And then you can be more of kind of the arbiter to just manage things with the project. In this case, because I have an intro class, I let them mess up. I give them some bonus points for going to the library research session, for giving peer feedback. Peer feedback's very important. And so I give them many ways to recover. Students are still going to mess up on it horribly. I had students this semester who interpreted politics as, and I said specifically, how was voting, representation, citizen activism affected by Hurricane Katrina? They saw politics and just talked about the politicians. And we had a little talk about that. So students will mess up, but this is a chance for them to try something and mess up. I don't have it be a huge part of their grade. I have it be 20 points. So it's significant, but it's not going to fail them in the class. And because I have an intro class, I'm giving them an opportunity to mess up and an opportunity to learn from that. And that's another thing that I've noticed, especially new students coming in. They've never had a chance to mess up, and they're so afraid of it, which is why they're not speaking. And so if you let them know, yeah, if you mess up, it's okay. It's a learning experience, but you have to back that up. And this is, again, where the trust comes in. You can set really firm standards, but you have to be willing to give them some chances to patch it up. This doesn't mean be a softie. End of semester, I'm negotiating that myself and trying to say, okay, how many chances did they have? At a certain point, you do have to kind of call it. But that also is a learning experience too. And so overall, I try to make everything that happens in the class be something where they learn. And this way, when a student comes up to you and says they're disturbed by something or they're freaking out, I had a student, one of the books that we read was about child sex slavery, or it had child sex slavery in it. And he came up and he was very distressed, and he said, I've been thinking about this, and then I can see this perspective, and I can see this perspective, and oh my God, I'm thinking these horrible things. I said, no, you've won the class. You're allowed to be upset, but you went there, you saw it, you thought, wow, I can see these different perspectives now. And it's okay for you to be scared. But the fact that you opened yourself up to think about it, you've done it. Congratulations. And so emphasize to them, if they are distressed, that means they're learning. And that's the time when you need to go in and support them and validate them. All right, I have a few more minutes. Any thoughts or questions?
Again, I mean, from the perspective of teaching from the perspective of teaching international students who are not yet in their programs, but we do hear about issues that they have in their academic classes, and one of them is not quite making it in terms of participating. Even when we say, all right, you really have shown us that you have the English to deal with your courses, they may still come back, or we will hear from other people that they're just not engaging with the class discussion. Do you have experience of this, and how do you deal with it?
I would apply the same tricks that I use with introverted students. As someone whose mother is an immigrant and has English as their second language and has worked with people in Europe and such too, people where English is not their first language know the language oftentimes, but they're not as good at speaking on the fly, but they can be very effective at writing. And this will depend on how you want to judge participation. But I think that having a discussion forum, either as an option or as a supplement, is a very good way to do things. It's also a really good way to keep track of participation overall. So sometimes I'll look at, okay, who have been the star posters, who has posted the most, who has posted kind of in the middle, who has not even tried to post. And emphasize that if you don't speak in class, that's okay. You have to be engaged, and emphasize to them you can tell the difference on if they're engaged or not, and that do they seem to be learning, and ask people, make it a routine at the end of class, ask them, please post 3 thoughts from today's discussion on the discussion forums. You have to do a lot of legwork to set up the forums, but once you have it set up, then it's all there and available. You can also ask that they comment and respond to other people too. And so that's a way for people who may be uncertain about speaking to feel like they're included, emphasize to them that they're not deficient or lacking, and emphasize that you embrace many different types of communication and many types of thinking. And so if you frame it as we have many different types of students here, people who think at different speeds, people who are introverted or extroverted, people who talk and discuss things in different ways, here are many options for discussing. And I want you to be engaged in at least one of these ways. Then that is a way that you can make it more inclusive. But they do have to make the leap, and they do have to be willing to put in the effort at some point.
I think that's a good note to
Excellent.
conclude on.
All right.
I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking Sabrina for sharing all this with us.
Thank you very much.
Of course, the conversation doesn't have to last. I'm going to make a clean break for the
Yep.
recording.